Hello, true crimerers. So a few of you have asked if I plan to continue with the compilation videos, and this will be one of them. But I'm only going to do probably just one a week for a little while because I was uploading so many of them. And I still need my time away from this. So I'm posting this, and this will be my second compilation video with the On This Day in True Crime History videos that I did. So the first one was all the ones I did for April. So now this one is all the videos I made in that series for the month of May. So there are, I think I counted 19 total videos. Again, I did not do this every single day. But here you go. Here's more for you. So without further ado, here are 19 or so cases of On This Day in True Crime History. All right. Oh, also, before I forget, make sure you follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and it's all linked in the link tree below. And I have merch, and I have a Discord server, and what else? I don't know. Anyway, viewer discretion's advised. Have fun. Hello and good evening, true crimers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History, and it is May 1st. And I actually got the information for this video from the Today in True Crime Parcast, so thank you to them. Today, we're going to Sicily, in Italy. Stop it. Look, it's right there. Boom. On May 1st, 1947, at the Portella della Ginestra, I tried, hundreds of people were gathered. The people there that day mainly consisted of the lower class, the ones who weren't all that wealthy. And it was May Day, a day to, I guess, celebrate communist Sicilian peasants. When speakers began to speak, all of a sudden, gunfire rang out. The gunfire was coming from somewhere in the hills nearby, and it sounded like machine guns. There were also several men riding in on horseback, shooting into the crowd. And when it was all said and done, 11 people were killed, including 4 children. 27 others were seriously wounded. So, who did this? This fella right here, Salvatore Giuliano. I looked it up how to say his name. He wanted to punish leftists because the recent election results, well, they didn't go the way he wanted them to go. I feel like I've heard this before. Must have been a dream. Now, he said the goal that day was to shoot over their heads and just scare people. There was never intent to kill anyone. When you fire machine guns towards the direction of a crowd, you gotta expect some casualties there, pal. Afterwards, people said, this wasn't a political attack. This was just good old-fashioned bandits doing their old bandit thing. It would create political unrest, but eventually Salvatore would be arrested. But he would be murdered on July 5th, 1950. But his cohorts would still go on trial, and they got life imprisonment. And to this day, the massacre at the Portella della Ginestra is still kind of controversial, and motives are still kind of unknown. By the way, there's a lot more to this story, so this is really just a very generalized retelling. But that is what happened today in True Crime History. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History, and today is May 2nd. What true crimey thing happened today? On May 2nd, 1960, 38-year-old Carol Chessman was executed in the gas chamber. What did he do to get there? Well, he didn't kill anyone. He committed a series of robberies and thefts throughout Los Angeles, California in the late 1940s. Now, he also did kidnap a young woman, and he did sexually assault her. He would eventually be arrested for those crimes. He was put on trial, and he was convicted. And due to a loose interpretation of something called the Little Lindbergh Law from kidnapping, It was an acceptable sentence at that time to sentence the perpetrator to death, and that is exactly what he got. But there is one more detail about this story that is kind of horrifying. Now, he was a bad dude, right? He deserved to be in prison, and he was in San Quentin prison in California. But obviously nowadays, people only get sentenced to death when they commit murders. In 1960, the Little Lindbergh Law, as it was known, was essentially repealed, but it was not a retroactive thing, meaning anyone who had previously been convicted under it would still adhere to the same sentence. But Carroll Chessman, on the day of his execution, on the hour of his execution, was granted a stay of execution, which means he was no longer going to be executed. But the secretary who was responsible for calling the prison, which would then go to the gas chamber room, essentially, she dialed the wrong number. And because of that, because they weren't informed in time, Carroll Chessman was put into the gas chamber, where he died. He even nodded his head a couple of times towards the media who were in the room because he had set up a little a code to them that if he was nodding his head, that means he was in extreme pain. Again, not excusing his actions, of course, but holy shit, that really sucks, especially for him. But at any rate, that is what happened on this day in true crime history. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History, and today is May 3rd. What happened on May 3rd? Well, I'm pretty sure you can figure that out. In the late evening hours of May 3rd, 2007, 3-year-old Madeleine McCann would disappear from her apartment in Praia de Luz, Portugal. The McCann family, who lives in England, was vacationing in Portugal with some friends of theirs. Now, that evening, the McCann parents, Kate and Jerry, had gone to the Tapas Bar and Restaurant. It's about 180 feet away from where their rental apartment was. This is as the crow flies, though. It actually was more complicated of a walk to get to the apartment to the restaurant, but they allege that they asked for a certain table at the tapas bar so they can see the apartment complex from where they were sitting. This is because the McCann children were asleep in their apartment. So essentially, the adults left the children in the apartment while they were sleeping to go to the restaurant. They claim that every 30 minutes or so, one of them would get up, go check on the kids, and come right back. One of the times that Jerry went to go check on the kids, he said that the door to the children's bedroom was wide open, even though he swears he left it just partially cracked. But when he peeked inside the room, all the kids were there. And that was around 8:30 that night. At 9 o'clock, when Kate went back to check on the kids, and this was the bedroom, Madeleine was no longer in her bed. The other kids were there. It was at this point where she noticed that the window was wide open. Just a few minutes later, the police would be notified and the investigation would begin. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here with this. I would highly recommend you watch the Netflix docuseries, The Disappearance of Madeleine McCann, because they go into extreme detail and they show you everything. But there was a lot of issues with the police. The lead detective in charge was kind of a hot mess. People were just being accused left and right, including and especially Madeleine's parents, which is reasonable because you have to look at them first. They would eventually be cleared, but a lot of people still don't feel that they're innocent. One of their friends was also accused because he was the last one to check on the kids before Kate went to check on them to notice that she was missing. There were sightings of a man who was holding a little girl walking away from the apartment complex. Everyone believed that was Madeleine. Turns out, it was not. To this very day, no one knows where Madeleine McCann is. I believe she is no longer alive. Police recently arrested Christian Bruckner, who was named a suspect a couple years ago. He has yet to be charged, but I expect more details will come soon. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 4th. Well, what happened on May 4th? Monday, May 4th, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio. Somewhere around 2,000 college students, high school students, they would gather for a protest. What were they protesting? Well, President Nixon had made some campaign promises to withdraw from Vietnam. Well, we ended up becoming more involved in the Vietnam War, and it expanded into Cambodia, and many college students around the country were pretty upset by this. So Kent State University students planned a peaceful protest. And that's basically how it started. Now, the crowd this day sort of just kind of came together randomly. There wasn't really like a leader for this group. Now, there were also protests at the school in the days prior to this, so the Ohio National Guard was there on May 4th. At some point during the protest, the National Guard had ordered the crowd to disperse, which would later on down the road prove to be something that they were legally allowed to do. Now, they said this over like a bullhorn, and most of the people in the crowd claimed they didn't hear the disperse orders. So the National Guard then deployed tear gas into the crowd. But that didn't exactly go great. They ended up missing most of the crowd, and most of the crowd was able to kind of just move away from the tear gas and continue protesting. Not to mention the wind that day carried most of the tear gas away. So the crowd became a little more unruly at this point. They began to chant things like, "Pigs off campus!" So the guardsmen began to push the crowd back. They fired more tear gas. At this point, the crowd was now backing away, and they were beginning to throw little rocks and pebbles at the guardsmen. And then, at 12:24 p.m., the National Guardsmen began to shoot their weapons into the crowd. The barrage of gunfire lasted roughly 13 seconds, and they fired about 67 total shots. When the dust settled, 4 students had been shot dead. 9 other students were injured by gunfire. In the following days, they would investigate why did the guardsmen begin to fire. Well, some of them said that they were in fear for their lives, that a sniper had shot at them first. They were throwing rocks at us, so pew pew. At any rate, 4 of the National Guardsmen would be initially charged with criminal offenses. But in the end, all of the charges were dropped, and nobody was held responsible. In 2007, someone found what's called the Stroob tape. There was an audio recording going on during the protest, and in that recording you can hear the National Guardsmen ordering to fire, meaning it was intended. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History, and today is May 6th. So, what happened on May 6th? Well, pictured here was Roberta Kathleen Parks, but her family would just call her Kathleen. She would grow up in Ohio. She was described as a very shy, very kind of closed-off individual. She did not smile a lot, and she was never considered like a very outspoken person. Like, she never raised her hand in class to answer questions. And you know what? That's okay. It's okay to be that way. She was also described as an incredibly beautiful individual. In fact, many people thought she would eventually become some sort of a model. But she was actually really interested in religious studies. Now, by 1974, she was studying at Oregon State University, and she was living on campus. She had recently broke up with her boyfriend, who they still loved each other very much. He wanted to get married, but she was really just not ready for that kind of commitment. Now, on the morning of May 6, 1974, she had gotten a call from her family that her father had just suffered a heart attack, and she said she felt incredibly guilty because she had just recently had an argument with her parents. But then later in the evening, she got another call saying that it looks like Dad is going to be okay. That being said, she was under a ton of stress. She had just broken up with her boyfriend. She had an argument with her parents. She almost lost her father. She was completely out of sorts. At around 11 p.m. on May 6, 1974, she was last seen walking throughout her university. She was passing by an area called Sackett Hall when she was stopped by a stranger. And then she was never seen alive again. Now, around that exact same time, just one state away in Washington, a whole bunch of other women were also going missing. And while she was about 250 miles away from where that was happening, people were still like, ugh, could it be the same person? 9 months later, Kathy's skull would be discovered on Taylor Mountain. They were there along with the remains of women Brenda Ball, Susan Rancourt, and Linda Healy. The stranger that picked Kathy up that night on May 6, 1974? This guy. I found the most hideous photo of him that I could, because he was a hideous person, not ever meant to be idolized. If you don't know, this is Ted Bundy. Roberta Kathleen Parks was his fourth victim. Asked why it was so easy to get Kathleen, he answered probably because he was just convincing enough. She needed to get things off her mind. She was having a bad day. She was a human being and a victim, yet there are still people that glamorize her killer. Stop it.
Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History, and it is May 7th. What happened on May 7th? This big galump here, Edmund Kemper of California, Jesus, giraffe on a stick. Well, this tall drink of, here, drink this acid water, he was officially indicted for a whole bunch of murders. Specifically the murders of 8 women. He was also known as the co-ed killer. He also killed his grandmama and his grandfather. He would also go on to kill his own mother. Anyway, the big guy with the big deep voice, he would go on to be convicted of all these murders, and he was given 8 concurrent life sentences. And that is what happened on this day in true crime history.
Hello and good evening, true crimers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History, and today is May 9th. What happened on May 9th? Not really a true crime, but it does fall into my page's categories because it's a worst freak accidents. May 9th, 1999. It was Mother's Day, and this takes place in New Orleans, Louisiana. There were 46 individuals on a charter bus just like this one, and they were transferring those people from a suburb in New Orleans to a Mississippi casino. Most of the people on the bus that day were actually older women, all mothers. On the way to that casino resort, a tragedy would take place. While on the highway, the bus driver says that another vehicle tried to swerve in front of him, so he had to basically instinctively swerve the bus to avoid hitting the car. This then caused him to go across 4 lanes as he was trying to not hit all the other cars in his way. The bus would then crash through one of the metal rail guards, and it kind of went down a little embankment. The bus then continued to careen down the kind of grass line there for about 50 to 60 yards, where it crashed through a chain link fence, and then finally it ended up crashing into a tree. The bus was completely mangled. The entire front of the bus was actually smashed in. The bus driver himself would survive, but he was critically injured. It would later come out that the bus driver was having health problems and he apparently had marijuana in his system, but I don't think that necessarily means that he created the accident. He himself would die 3 months after this incident from heart failure. When rescuers got to the scene, there were people kind of just sort of smushed and laying on top of each other. There were metal parts inside the bus that were completely scrunched in on top of people. There were many people who got entangled inside the mechanisms of the bus. When they arrived, there were 19 people pronounced dead right then and there at the scene. Most of them had died from some form of blunt force trauma. The bus did not have any seatbelts, so once the crash happened, people were being thrown all over the place. 4 more individuals would die later at the hospital, which brings the death total to 23 people. From what I understand, everyone who died and everyone who was injured were all on the bus itself, and no one else outside the bus was critically injured. Now, eventually, blame would be put 50-50, so half of it was blamed on the bus driver for losing control, and the other half was placed on the State Highway Department. There were liability lawsuits filed, but those were settled out of court, so they were private. And that's what happened on Today in True Crime History. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 10th. What happened on May 10th? This is Charing Cross Railway Station in London. That's in England. One of the people that worked there, well, they began to notice a very bad pungent, gross smell, and it was coming from their luggage department. As they got closer to the smell, they were able to tell which trunk it was coming from. On May 10th, 1927, they opened the trunk. Inside the trunk were a pair of women's shoes, a purse, and what else? Oh, a dismembered human body. Turns out people did gross things even back in old-timey days. The body's legs were hacked off at the hips, and the arms were sliced off at the shoulders. Each piece of human remain was wrapped in brown paper and tied in a neat little bow with some string. You know, the same way they would present, like a cut of roast to you at the deli. The killer might have gotten away with all of this had he not realized there were names, stitched into the clothing. The name on there said P. Holt. Police were able to track that to a woman in South Kensington. Now, she was not the person in the trunk, but when police spoke to her, she was able to identify who it was. The body in the trunk belonged to Minnie Bonatti. She had recently left her husband and daughter and became a lady of the night. Now, etched into a portion of the trunk was the word Greyhound. Now, the investigation would lead police to somewhere in Rochester Row, which is in Westminster. I don't know how they got to this conclusion, but they found out about a man by the name of John Robinson. Oh, yeah, that checks out. He had a wife who worked at the Greyhound Hotel. In one of the rooms he subletted to people, police found blood. So John Robinson was arrested. So he would eventually confess that he picked a woman up, a prostitute. He alleges she demanded a lot more money. She rushed towards him, so he struck her over the head. And he just left her on the ground thinking she had just passed out. He came back the next day and realized, she was still on the ground, so I gotta get rid of her. So he then chopped her into pieces and put her in a trunk and left her at a railway station. Whether that story is true or not, he still confessed to killing her. He was convicted of her murder, and he would end up being hanged. So that's what happened on this day in true crime history. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today, depending on where you live, of course, is May 11th. What happened on May 11th? On May 11th, 2004, near the shores of Chesapeake Bay in Virginia, a suitcase would be found. When the suitcase was opened, they would find a torso and a severed head with 2 bullet holes. This was the second suitcase of body parts found in a matter of just a few days. On May 5th, 2004, this all began when a suitcase washed up on shore in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and inside that suitcase, 2 human legs. And then finally on May 16th, 2004, one more suitcase that contained 2 human arms. Police would come up with this composite drawing of the head found in the second suitcase. Shortly after they released this drawing, the friends of a recently missing man would come forward to say that they think that that was their friend, William McGuire, who went by Bill. It would then be confirmed to be his remains in all 3 suitcases. The very first person that the friends said did this, William's wife, Melanie. The 2 of them would marry in 1999, and they had a couple of kids together. Eventually, they would move into this house in New Jersey that would actually cause them some issues in their marriage. Bill wanted to move to Virginia Beach, but they settled on this home in New Jersey. Melanie would say that the 2 of them argued just a few days before he disappeared about the house. So, police began investigating Melanie's movements. Well, on April 26, 2004, Melanie went and purchased a gun. This gun would use the same exact bullets that were found inside of the body of Bill. They interviewed the person who sold her the gun and said, yeah, that was definitely her. Now, before his body was found, they actually located Bill's vehicle on April 30th, 2004 in Atlantic City. Walking away from that vehicle, caught on CCTV, Melanie. She then got into a vehicle in the passenger side, which means she had an accomplice that they believe is her stepfather. The suitcases belonged to the McGuires. It was a part of a 3-piece set that were all now currently missing from their home. The garbage bags that his body parts were found in inside the suitcases, they were part of the same roll found in their home. Melanie was also sleeping with another man at this time. She had the means, she had the motive, she had it all. She was arrested and charged with the murder of her husband. On April 23, 2007, Melanie McGuire, dubbed the Suitcase Killer, was found guilty of the murder of her husband. She drugged him with Xanax and then shot him twice, cut him up into pieces with help likely, and then disposed of his body with help also likely. But no one else has been charged. She got life without parole, and that's what happened on this day in true crime history. Hello, true crimeers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 12th. What happened on May 12th? On May 12, 1932, the body of the missing Lindbergh baby was accidentally found. A man who just needed to use the restroom and couldn't hold it had to pull off on the side of the road, and that is how the body was discovered. The body of 20-month-old Charles Augustus Lindbergh was badly decomposed, and there were missing parts to his body, likely from animal activity. How did we get here? Well, I will tell you briefly, because there is a lot more to the story. Charles Lindbergh was an aviator who became worldwide famous when he and his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, made the first non-stop flight from New York to Paris. His wife, Anne, was also an aviator. On June 22nd, 1930, their first son, Charles Augustus Lindbergh, was born in New Jersey. The Lindbergh family was very wealthy, and they owned this weekend home in New Jersey. On March 1st, 1932, the Lindbergh's nanny, Betty Gow, would go into the baby's nursery sometime around 8 p.m. and noticed that Charles Lindbergh Jr. was fast asleep. Later on that evening, around 10 p.m., she went back in the room just to check on the baby, and now he was gone. She went to Anne thinking that maybe she took the baby out of the room, but she didn't. Anne thought that maybe Charles was pulling a prank because a few weeks prior to this, the father, Charles, he took the baby out of the room and hid him in a closet as a prank. Totally normal. This was not that. Outside of the nursery's window, there was this wooden ladder. After searching the house, searching the grounds, they realized that the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped. There were traces of mud on the nursery's floor. There were footprints in the mud below. On the windowsill of the nursery was this exact ransom note, and it would be one of several ransom notes. Charles Lindbergh did not want to get the police involved so heavily. He wanted to just provide the money and get his baby back. He would actually pay the ransom money to a man when they met at a cemetery. He was nicknamed Cemetery John, and he had a distinct German accent. Charles Lindbergh only ever heard him speak 2 words. The biggest issue is the Lindberghs were hoaxed many times. People demanding money, but then they never showed proof of the baby. But it all came to an end on May 12, 1932. Eventually, police would be able to trace the ransom money back to a man by the name of Bruno Hauptmann from Germany. The wood to build a ladder was in his home, so was the ransom money. He would be convicted and then executed. Hello and good evening, true crimeers. It's time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 15th. What happened on May 15th? Well, hey, what's up, girl? How you doing? This little nugget of fun, huh? That's Aileen Wuornos. She's one of the most infamous serial killers of all time, and she hailed from Florida. She was convicted of murdering 6 men. On May 15th, 1992, she was sentenced to 3 more death sentences, on top of the 3 she had already received. This time for the murders of Charles Humphreys, Troy Barres, and David Spears. And on October 9th, 2002, Cuckoo Cuckoo Wackadoo Wuornos here was executed. She had received lethal injection and she was 46 years old. And that's what happened today in true crime history. Hello, true crimeers. Guess what? It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 17th. What happened on May 17th? Well, let me tell you. Ma'am? Serial husband killer and overall cuckoo cuckoo wackadoo, Nannie Doss, otherwise known as the Giggling Granny, is sentenced for her murders. Now, she would only be convicted of one murder, the final husband that she killed, and she was sentenced to life in prison without parole. What's her story? Giggling Nannie here was born in 1905 in Blue Mountain, Alabama. She was never educated because her parents basically made all the kids work on the farm in lieu of going to school. By her teenage years, she said, "I want to settle down with a nice man and just live the rest of my life just loving my husband. Maybe the next husband. Maybe the next husband. Maybe the next husband." Yeah. She would utilize the Lonely Hearts ads to find herself a nice gentleman or 5. And by age 16, she found herself her first husband. They would end up having some kids together, but somehow 2 of those children died mysteriously. By 1928, she divorced her first husband. Within a year, she was married to her next. She would use the Lonely Hearts ads again, and she would send him some scantily clad photos. During this marriage, Nannie had 2 grandkids who also mysteriously died, both while in her care. Then her husband took some swigs of some moonshine and he was dead within a week. Then Nannie met her 3rd husband, but then he would die after eating some food she prepared. Then she married again. During this marriage, Nannie's mother, who she was helping take care of, also mysteriously died. And then one of her sisters mysteriously died. And the last person to see the sister was Nannie. Meanwhile, this current husband would also die mysteriously. He too fancied some moonshine. Then she got married for the 5th time. Okay, I believe that this time has got to be the charm, right? No, wrong. Yeah. She would lace her famous prune cake with something horrible. Her husband got really sick, but he just wouldn't die. Then she's like, "Take some sips of this coffee." Boom, he dies. You know, the autopsies would show that some guys just can't hold their arsenic. Massive amounts of arsenic. She was finally found out. She laughed during her confessions, enjoyed telling the stories, and smiled away. She died in prison in 1964. Hello and good evening, true crimerers, and also this furry fella. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 22nd. What happened on May 22nd? Well, a few things. First, serial killer and all-around creep Peter Sutcliffe, also known as the Yorkshire Ripper. On May 22nd, 1981, he was convicted of 13 murders and 7 attempted murders. Yes, I have covered his case before. Next, on May 22nd, 2002, a year after she disappeared, the body of Chandra Levy would be discovered. To this day, her murder is still unsolved. And yes, I have covered her story as well. And finally, on May 22nd, 2010, Air India Express Flight 812 would overshoot its landing and crash over a hilltop, killing 158 people. The pilot was heard snoring on the radio shortly before the crash. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 23rd. What happened on May 23rd? Well, let's start at the beginning. Pictured here is Bonnie and Clyde. It's believed the two of them first met in January 1930. Clyde Barrow was 20 years old and Bonnie Parker was 19. And it's believed they met for the first time in Dallas, Texas. Between somewhere around 1932 and 1934, Bonnie and Clyde, along with a little gang of theirs, they would commit a whole lot of robberies. Bank robberies, heists, and it's believed that over the course of that time, they murdered at least 9 different police officers. They may have killed up to 13 people total. The exact number is kind of debated, and it's really not known for sure, but they did commit some murders. Bonnie and Clyde took over the press at the time, almost romanticized them. The authorities were hot on their trail for the course of about 2 years, and finally, they caught up with them. So on this day, May 23rd, 1934, when there was roughly 16 warrants out for their arrest, well, it all came to an end in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Lawmen had discovered where they were, and they set up an ambush. 7 different lawmen were there that day, and they laid in wait until Bonnie and Clyde arrived in their infamous vehicle. It was a Ford V8. And then those lawmen let out with a barrage of bullets. Roughly 130 bullets were fired into their vehicle, killing both Bonnie and Clyde. Their bodies were torn to shreds, and the infamous duo would go down in history. There would be films made about their exploits, and even sometimes today you'll hear about killer couples who are compared to Bonnie and Clyde. But just know, they were the first, they were the original. And that's what happened on this day in true crime histories. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 24th. What happened on May 24th? Well, a few things. On May 24th, 2012, Pablo Fernandez was arrested and charged with the kidnapping and murder of Etan Patz. He would confess to kidnapping and murdering the 6-year-old boy. He would end up going through a few trials, some that ended in a mistrial, but eventually he was convicted of the kidnapping and murder and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Next, May 24th, 1930. Serial killer Peter Kürten, also known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, was arrested. But he was actually turned in by his own wife. Something they actually arranged together because there was a reward for turning him in. So he allowed his wife to turn him in so that she could secure a financial future. He would go on to be executed, and his severed head was turned into a museum exhibit. Initially, it was used for research to understand the mind of someone like Peter Kürten, and now it sits at the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. It's actually pretty cool to look at. And finally, on May 24th, 1964, in Lima, Peru, the Lima football disaster would occur. There was about 53,000 people in the stadium at the time. It was a big game. Basically, a referee made a decision that displeased the fans, and they decided to riot. And then that riot would lead to disaster. Tear gas was shot into the crowd. People were fleeing and trying to run. They had shutters that were closed and locked, so this massive crowd of people began to run towards it and were all crushed against it. At minimum, 328 people died during this event. People sure love their sports. But at any rate, that is what happened on today in true crime history. Oh, hi! Aren't you a friendly fella, huh? Anyway, hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is now time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 26th. What happened on May 26th? Oh, well, odds are that you're not such a good fella. Okay, I see that now. You have handcuffs on, so. On May 26, 1971, Juan Corona, otherwise known as the Machete Murderer, was arrested. And you guys probably don't want to know the rest, so that's it, bye! I'm fucking with ya. On May 19th, 1971, a farmer would notice a freshly dug hole on a peach orchard. Inside that freshly dug hole, a human body. And then another body. And then another body. And then another. And then another. And then another. Police would uncover the remains of at least 25 different men. On one of the bodies, they found a receipt. That receipt had the name Juan Corona on it. On a couple other bodies, there were Bank of America bank deposit slips. On those slips had the name Juan Corona. Who the hell is Juan Corona, they wondered? Well, Mr. Corona was born in Mexico in 1934. By 1962, he had legally entered the United States of America through a green card. Yes, in the years prior, he had been to the United States under not-so-legal terms, but before anyone starts to go, oh, immigrant, just remember that plenty of homegrown American citizens have done exactly what he did, if not horribly worse. But when he did what he did, he was here very legally. So zip it. Now, while here in America, he had seen a psychiatrist because he was having some mental health issues. He would eventually be diagnosed with schizophrenia. By the early to mid-60s, he had received very good treatment. He was doing okay. In 1970, he had a bit of a relapse, but then he was treated and he was back on the upswing. Now, he was a licensed labor contractor and he was able to hire people to work for farms. And that's exactly what he did. Now, these 25 men here, they all had at some point a criminal record, but another thing they had in common was they had all been contracted to work and hired by Juan Corona. Several of these men were seen by witnesses for the very last time in a pickup truck with Juan Corona. These are the 21 men that they actually have photos of, but all 21 of these men plus a few more were found buried in that peach orchard. They had all been stabbed to death, except for one who had been shot. All of the evidence pointed to Juan Corona, so he was arrested on May 26, 1971. He ended up going through 2 trials, but ultimately was convicted. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died in prison at the age of 85. Natural causes. Hello and good evening, true crimerers. It is time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 27th. What happened on May 27th? On the afternoon of May 27th, 1973, Betty Tyson was arrested for murder. What's the story? Well, let's talk about it. In 1973, Betty Tyson was a 24-year-old resident of Rochester, New York. She was into drugs and she was also into prostitution. Unfortunately, I don't really have many photos of this case, especially the one of the victim, but in May of 1973, a white businessman from Philadelphia was in New York on business. His name was Timothy Haworth. His body would be found, and he appeared to have been bludgeoned and strangled to death. The consensus, based on interviews, was that he had hired a prostitute for the evening. 2 teenagers who apparently were acquaintances of Betty Tyson said they saw her and another prostitute, a man by the name of John Duvall. They claimed they saw both of them with Timothy Haworth. I don't have a photo of John Duvall, but he was also a black man. So, they were both picked up by police and arrested on that May 27th day. There was no physical evidence connecting her or John to the crime. The only witnesses who can place them around the victim were 2 delinquents who also had issues with drugs and who were unreliable. They went to trial, and Betty and John were both convicted of the murder and were both sentenced to 25 years to life. In 1997, somewhere around Betty's 50th birthday, one of the 2 teenagers would come forward to say that they were coerced into that, witness statement, stating that the Rochester police had put a gun to his head and said, "If you don't tell us she did it, we'll shoot you." Betty, well, she was also beaten into a confession. She was handcuffed to a chair during her initial interrogation, and she gave them the answers that she thought they wanted to get them to stop beating her. Lawyers would then uncover documents from the original case file. A document that stated that the 2 teenage witnesses claimed originally they had not seen Betty and John with Timothy. Back in 1980, one of the officers who had interrogated Betty and John, he had gone to prison for falsifying evidence. It was a pattern. So in May of 1998, Betty Tyson and John Duvall both had their convictions overturned and they were released. Prosecutors decided not to retry Betty because they had no evidence. They considered retrying John Duvall only because he claimed he did kill the man in his parole hearings, because that's what they want to hear you say to get out. So he went to trial and he was acquitted. Don't know who killed the man. Hello and good evening, true crimers. It's time for another On This Day in True Crime History. This evening is May 28th. What happened on May 28th? A couple of things. I don't know what any of that just was. On May 28th, 1998, comedian and actor known for news radio and Saturday Night Live, Phil Hartman, was murdered by his wife, Bryn. She would shoot him to death while he slept. A couple of hours later, she took her own life. I've made a video about Phil Hartman before. Secondly, on May 28th, 1945, this Nazi, let's call him, William Joyce, he was finally captured on the border of Denmark. He would then be convicted of high treason. What a shame. He was executed in 1946. Got the rope. Yup. And that's what happened on Today in True Crime History. Hello Hello and good evening, true crimers. God, okay. It's time for another On This Day in True Crime History. Today is May 29th. Sir, what happened on May 29th? A whole-ass Tim Burton movie, otherwise known as Phil Spector, was convicted of murder. Good Lord. So, to those who don't know, Phil Spector was a once respected record producer, mainly from like the 60s and the 70s. He worked with like Ike and Tina Turner, the Righteous Brothers. At one point in the 70s, he worked with the Beatles, and then he decided to apparently become the Crypt Keeper. Spector was worth a lot of money. Alright, a ton. This is a real photo of him. Anyway, sadly, people with a lot of money, people like Phil Spector, they like to use that money as a way of saying, well, that means you should definitely sleep with me, right? I should be able to get the things that I want because I have money. He lived here in this mansion called the Pyrenees Mansion, and it was in Alhambra, California. On the night of February 3rd, 2003, Phil Spector had a guest. It was actress Lana Clarkson. She did a lot of like 80s guest starring roles on TV shows. She was in like a handful of movies or so, but unfortunately her career just never truly took off. She had attended a party earlier on February 3rd, 2003, a party that Phil Spector was also at, and I guess he invited her back to his, little tiny house. Approximately 2 hours after they arrived at the home, Phil Spector's driver, Adriana De Sousa, he called 911 and reported that his boss said, "I think I may have killed her," and that Mr. Spector also had a gun in his hand. When police arrived at the mansion, yes, I have to block her out, they noticed Lana Clarkson slumped in a chair with a gunshot wound through her mouth. She had been shot with a revolver, which was now resting by her feet. Phil Spector said she went to kiss the gun and accidentally it went off. So he said it was an accidental self-unaliving. Her family would say, yes, she was feeling a little down. Her career never took off, but she had made a whole bunch of plans and she was excited about those plans. She had bought a whole bunch of new stuff just the day prior. Oh, Jesus. 4 different women testified against Phil Spector, stating that he once drew a gun on all of them. After 2 trials, he would eventually be convicted and sentenced to life. He died in prison of COVID in 2021.